Well, good morning and welcome. Thank you for being here this morning. I'm pleased to welcome Geoff Calkins to Grace St. Luke's and to thank all of you for joining us today for a conversation. We're being joined online by some folks, and others will watch it at another time, but it's a really exciting way for us to have a conversation about faith and journalism and all that that means for our speaker in particular. But before we begin, let us pray. The Lord be with you. Gracious God, thank you for the gift of life. Thank you for this time in this space. Thank you for the ministries to which we are called and the ways that we live them out. Thank you especially this day for Geoff Calkins, for his contributions to this community and beyond, and for a time of fellowship and conversation, all rooted in you. In Christ's name, amen. So, Geoff, we're glad you're here.
Good to be here.
This
Thanks.
is
Absolutely.
really exciting. And before we begin, just to give you a little context about Geoff, succeeding graduation from Harvard College and law school and practicing law in Washington, Geoff worked as a columnist at the Commercial Appeal and the Daily Memphian and has been lauded several times as the best sports columnist in the country. That's a big deal, right? We should give him an applause on that one, right?
Thank you.
He is the author of After the Jump, columns on the best 20 years in Memphis sports, and was featured in the 2022 Calvary Lenten Preaching series. I invited Geoff here today because he's a person of faith, and that's some of what our conversation has been about, but of course we'll go into that even more fully. He cares about people. He cares about the stories that are unique to those about whom he writes. So please join me in welcoming Geoff.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we begin, why don't you just give us a snapshot? How did you end up in Memphis and what brought you to this place and to kind of set the stage?
I'm one of 9 kids. I grew up outside of Buffalo, New York on a little farm, and I would have remained a Yankee. My 8 brothers and sisters all still live up there. And when I was a lawyer, I was a lawyer in D.C., and I would have stayed up there. But then in the journalism business, even back when it was thriving, there were very few jobs. I mean, I wrote 300 newspapers when I was looking for my first job, and the only job offer I got was at the Anniston Star, making $225 a week, covering high school sports. And I was 30, and I took it, and I decided to embark on this. And then it was from Anniston to Fort Lauderdale, where I covered the Florida Marlin baseball team. And then the way that jobs came open then, back when there were journalism jobs, it feels like there aren't even any journalism jobs now, but back when there were, my predecessor, Al Dunning, he died one night after covering this. I don't blame Mississippi State, but it was a Mississippi State game. And I'd never met him because I succeeded him. But he continued in the tradition of really fine sports columnists in Memphis, and so they found me in Fort Lauderdale. And like so many people, I think, who end up here from somewhere else, I came here thinking I'd be here 2 years, and here we are, 27 years later, and it really has been the best. I had a lovely childhood, which I adored, but it has been the best, most meaningful part of my life is my days here in Memphis. It's really where I've been able to live the life that I've wanted to live and have the communities that I've wanted to have and raise my kids. It's just been spectacular. So that's sort of how I wound up there.
Well, we're glad.
How I wound up in this chair, however, is an adventure because Ollie was trying to get a hold of me, and I'm not the best correspondent, partly because I get so many emails and calls. And then the other problem that you all, I'm sure, can identify with is they can reach you through so many places. So there's Facebook Messenger, and there's my email at work, and there's my email at my other work. I work with Dan Barron at the radio station. That email I refuse to even know how to log on to. So and then there's Twitter direct messages, and then there's whatever else. So Ollie was trying to get in touch with me, and I feel bad that I did not get in touch with him, and I have not. And so then this morning, I knew it was my day. So sure enough, I went to church. I went to the church, and I walked in, and I said, now, where would I find Ollie Rencher? And they said, are you sure Ollie's here today? And I said, yeah, no, I'm speaking to the rector's forum. And here's the Calvary brochure. I'm there next week. And that accounted for the confusion. So I'm very glad to be here.
And he's here on time.
And I do show up early because I know this sort of pratfall is typical of me. So anyway.
Well, I love it. And I actually didn't know that much until right now. So I'm just learning that too.
Not to say.
Right. Well, so Geoff, I was thinking, I have looked forward to welcoming you here to Grace St. Luke's, not to Calvary.
Right.
Right. And in addition to your reputation and distinction as a talented journalist, many know you for your sports writing, right? But you preached on April the 7th of 2022 at Calvary Episcopal Church as a part of their popular Lenten Preaching series. And I had the privilege of seeing that sermon, and it was rich. It was based on these questions. Have you ever lost faith? What do you do when your faith is shaken? How do you maintain your faith in difficult times? And I recall those opening remarks that you gave before you spoke, that you were both honored and you were intimidated to be invited to preach. And when I think about our topic today, my question is, how do you describe that experience of writing and delivering that sermon?
Terrifying. Terrifying. I talk all the time. I talk too much, probably. I talk every morning from 9 to 11 on the radio, and then I talk to Rotary clubs, and I talk to Optimist clubs, and I talk wherever I'm asked. But to be asked to preach a sermon, that is something else. And so, the great preachers of the world preaching that Calvary series. And so, when Scott asked me to do it, practically from that day forward, I didn't stop worrying about it for a year. And it got to be the point where I would even dream about it, not in a positive way. A dream about before I delivered the sermon, I dreamed, this is 100% true, I dreamed that I went to the Calvary Lenten Preaching series to hear Micah Greenstein deliver his sermon. This was my dream. And it was actually my day. So it's a version of the sort of being unprepared for your exam thing, whatever. So it was terrifying, but it did cause me to think about, what do you say? And it so happened that year was the year that it was the basketball season. 2 years ago, basketball season, and the University of Memphis had a 8-game losing streak. And in the post-game press conference, Penny Hardaway, very colorfully, in a way that went viral, went off on me. He said, "Stop asking me stupid effing questions, bro." And he said, "Stop disrespecting me." And it went viral, and the whole world saw it, and whatever else. And so I went back and I listened to the question that I asked him that inspired this anger. And the question was, have you ever lost faith that you can get this done? And I sort of thought to myself, that's not a stupid effing question. That's the essential question, right? That's the question that we ask ourselves looking around the world right now. At the time, it's a question I asked about faith in Memphis. Have I lost faith in this community? And honestly, since then, it hasn't been any easier. And so that's sort of what I decided to talk about, was this question of how do you maintain your faith in these tricky times? And I'm not saying that I had the answer, but it was the one and only sermon I'll ever deliver. So you can watch it on YouTube.
Yeah, I do commend it for sure. And I was just thinking about that. But then also, most recently, you announced in the summer that you were shifting from sports to be less involved in sports writing, and then to be in a place of writing about broader stories about life. And I'm interested to hear, and others as well, about this new venture. What led you to this season in your career, and in particular, what has it been like to get to where you are now?
Yeah, I was the sports columnist. I came in '96, and so from '96 until just recently, I wrote 95% of my columns were about sports, and I had the best time. I covered 8 Olympics. I covered 15 Super Bowls. I covered the arrival of the Memphis Grizzlies and the grid grind era of the Grizzlies, and I covered Memphis football going to the Cotton Bowl, and just a lot of spectacular, wonderful things that I was able to see and write about. But the truth of the matter is, even then, during that 25-year period when I was doing that, the columns that people like best were the columns about people. It's just true, like that. And honestly, some of the columns that people like best, I wrote a column about taking my parents to Disney when they were 97 and 94, and I don't know that there's any column I've ever written that people responded to as warmly as that. Partly because I think they weren't so interested in my parents, but they connect it with your own experience with your own parents, and so I just decided, well, two things really. One is I was sort of weary of going to every game. I spent a lot of nights going to games and press conferences, and so some of it was just life. But then some of it was, if I'm going to do this for 5 more years or 10 more, however long, why don't I just focus on writing those columns, the columns that are about people and about this place where we live. I came to realize that as much as I love sports and cared about sports, I care about Memphis more. And so why don't I see if I can write about that? The part about not going to every games is nice, honestly. But the challenge has been this, is that when I write a human interest column, like today after this, I'm going to watch a football game with a woman on her 107th birthday. And so that's sort of fun. Like, that'll be fun. And so I can do one-off people columns and I enjoy those. I do want to weigh in on some of the issues of the day, and they're incredibly complicated. We might like to think they're simple, whether take MLG&W or bail reform or whereas if I was writing about an NCAA investigation of the University of Memphis, I know all the actors, I know the issues, I know who to call, I know. If I'm writing about a Department of Justice investigation into the police department, normally, I'd like to have a column that day. And I think this stuff is really, really, of course, it's obvious, but it's really complicated. We like to think that it's simple and that either Steve Mulroy is a bad guy who's letting all the people out, or that he's, or that he's standing up for truth, justice, whatever it is. But all this stuff is so intensely complicated that I haven't figured out, and I think it would be important to do that, to write about it in a way that really makes sense to people and gets to the nuanced truth of the matter. And I'd like to figure out a way to do that, and I haven't unlocked it yet.
Well, I'm glad you're in this space, and when we spoke, you were excited about the change, and that's what I'm hearing.
Oh, I am. I'm very excited about the change, and yeah, I mean, another column I have written, that I've already done the interview for, is of Dr. Justin Baker, who was at St. Jude and has just left St. Jude to go to Stanford, but was here for basically 20 years, and he has done. He worked essentially with sick and dying children, not at curing them, but at making their lives better. And just the opportunity to sit down and talk to him for an hour in his house was, I'll tell you what the best thing he said was, or the best thing that resonated for me, what he said. He said, the day that you tell someone that they have a incurable or illness is an awful day. He said, but the great thing about his job was that every day after that was, how do we make this day the best day it can be? And so we were talking about that in life, and like the end will come for all of us. And so is it realistic to say we should live every day like it's our last, or appreciate every moment? How do you realistically do that? That's impossible. We're not going to go out every day and observe how wonderfully green the grass is and take it in and thank God for it. But what he said is that he he can't do that, but what he can do is try to get the most out of every human interaction, treat every person in a way that it recognizes their humanity and he's present for them. And he was honestly like that with me. It was no phone, there was no whatever. And that seems to me something that is doable. Like, I can try to do that. I can try to be present in all my human interactions during the course of the day, even if I can't necessarily be singularly grateful for every day at that moment. So it's a privilege to talk to people, honestly, to go out and get their stories and to have them want to talk to me and write it down. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, I'm just hearing you say that. I'm mindful of something that you were very public about, something that you wrote about from your life as a third grader in Buffalo, New York, and your diagnosis with leukemia. And you talk about that in a time when many children were unable to survive such a diagnosis. In this space, I'd be interested to have you talk about some of that. What was that experience like? How has it shaped you? You were very intentional in sharing that so publicly.
Yeah, I've written about it from time to time.
Right.
I find it sort of miraculous that I ended up in Memphis with St. Jude right across the street, given my history. But yeah, when I was in third grade, I had shingles, and that was sort of the first clue that I had leukemia. And I later on, Mom was down here. Both my parents are gone now, but Mom was down here when we honestly, it was for my book, when the book was coming out. I invited him down, and I put him on the radio, and I asked Mom, I said, what was that like because we did not have a family where, I adore my family, but we didn't talk about sickness, or we just, we plowed ahead. Ask Mom, are you happy today? And she'd say, happiness? I've got to go feed the horses. That was sort of the approach. And so I did ask her. It was really the first time I asked her, what was it like to have me diagnosed with leukemia? And she said, because this was at a time when 99% of kids died with leukemia. And she said, I thought it would have been better if you'd been hit by a truck. Because I wouldn't have to go through the misery. My siblings wouldn't have to go through it. As it happened, my dad, it was an academic medicine. He knew, and St. Jude was sort of part of this community. It was St. Jude and a guy in New York named Jim Holland, and then the folks at Roswell Park in Buffalo. The actual first medical director of St. Jude came here from Roswell Park in Buffalo. So there's another connection between my life, sort of how it connects. They found this new regimen, and now this new regimen, 96% of kids with leukemia live. And so I'm obviously grateful for it. I wish that I had that appreciation of what a miracle my life is, because it really is. But in the same way that it's hard to appreciate every day, I think it's hard to feel that miracle every day. But I do think, I'm drawn to stories about people who, have their own personal struggles to get through, and maybe that comes partly from my own.
Okay, thank you. Well, thinking about faith and your journey as, a journalist, is faith something that was modeled for you by your parents? You, for instance, spoke about your uncle, your great uncle, who was ordained minister in Boston, and the family, that part of your family was significant, and it shaped you in some way. And I'm curious to hear more about that, because you mentioned it in several different ways.
It's funny, my dad's favorite prayer was, he was an old sort of, he's your classic flinty Northeastern Protestant, and his favorite prayer was, give me work until my life is over and life until my work is done. So that's the sort of, that's what, and so his uncle, there's a long line of ministers in my family, and his uncle was a minister, and and he kept a journal. So this was in the first part of the 20th century, and that he was writing this, and he was talking about his own development of faith, and he said this, and it's interesting. He said, Mine was no easy path into the profession, which I finally embraced. Indeed, it was long and difficult and a torturous one. I had difficulty in discovering any rock-bottom idea on which I could surely base my life. The reading of Sartor Restorastus, whatever that is, was a turning point in my experience. He wrote, in effect, that there is only one thing in this world that really matters. It does not matter whether you are happy or unhappy, or what you say you believe or do not believe, but to get your work done, to do your work. This is the end for which you were made. Do it though the heavens fall, and you will get into whatever heaven there be. That was his view at one point in his life. And then when he was deciding truly to become a minister, he wrote this. I suppose that the ministry had always lain in the back of my mind. My father and my father's brother were ministers. On my mother's side, there was a long ministerial tradition. Her grandfather, John Milton Whiten, had for 45 years been a Presbyterian minister in New Hampshire. Her brother, my Uncle James, was an outstanding congregational minister. In feeling, attitude, spiritual interest, and sympathy, I was thoroughly devout and sincerely religious. Above all, I was fond of people. Fonder of them than of books or anything else in the world. To be with them, to learn from them, to share with them. This I discovered to be the deepest interest in life. And I think that connects a little bit with journalism and with my own interests and my own faith. But then in his last sermon, this is from his last sermon, he wrote this. The non-Christian is not going to be won to Christ by the eloquence of the preachers, nor by the acumen of Christian thinkers, nor by the reasoning of theologians. You to whom I am preaching must be the preachers. This sermon of mine will not travel far, but if you to whom it is preached will go out and show to the world what a real Christian is, you will be presenting an unanswerable argument for the faith in which you believe and by which you live. The theory of Christianity may be debated, its institutions may be criticized, its doctrines may be denied, but it's hard to say anything against a real Christian. So what is a real Christian? He hates evil and attacks it wherever he finds it. He exhibits a spirit of human brotherhood lifted high above the level of class or racial prejudice. He is slow to be offended and quick to forgive. In prosperity, he is unassuming. In adversity, he is patient and brave. He never thinks of himself more highly than he ought to think, and is without hint of egotism. Like his master, he goes about doing good, has an eye for the underdog, the lonely, the neglected. He may or may not be a pacifist, but he does not believe in confronting our foes with pugnacity and the mailed fist, rather with firmness, yet in the spirit of conciliation and goodwill. And he exhibits a light and elastic heart amid all the darkness of the world in which we live, believing that God is the Lord of history and that ultimately nothing can defeat his moral purpose for mankind, thus helping to counteract the prevailing mood of pessimism and despair. And then he goes on, he says, Bayard Taylor has written, the healing of the world is by his nameless saints. Each separate star seems nothing, but a million scattered stars break up the night and make it beautiful. Each of us can become one of these stars. So that's his favorite, the final sermon that he gave. And my columns aren't sermons, of course, but I went and I did a column. I did a column recently on I'm trying to remember the names of the parents are Philip and Dory Jane, on Wes Smith. Wes Smith, who some of you may have known of his story. He grew up in Memphis. He went to TCU, and on a night earlier this year, standing outside of a bar, someone walked up and just shot him in the head. And nothing. There was no reason for any of this. And I happened to go do a column and talk to his parents. And they go to a different church and a different tradition than mine. But the faith that they showed in trying to make everyone around them, like among other things, the mom, Dory Jane, found out the next morning because a policeman came to her door. The dad was away. The policeman came to her door, and she looked out the door and she saw this. She thought maybe there was a prowler in the neighborhood. They were coming to alert her. And so the policeman comes to the door and gives her the news. And so what did she do? Like 5 days later, she called the policeman to make sure he was okay. she was worried about, she said that must have been, she was sitting outside in the living room, she said that must have been awful for him to have to deliver that news. That must have been a really bad day for him. And the care and that they were showing towards others in the midst of their grief was just, to me, it's not that my faith informs my journalism, it's that my journalism bolsters my faith, because I see stories like that and I read about people like that who are doing amazing things all the time. And I think that's, for me, the connection.
Thank you. Well, thinking about that and journalism and the state of journalism in the world today and in Memphis, how do you see that playing out in the coverage of the events that are happening in society, in the Middle East, and mass shootings and hate crimes and gun violence?
Yeah.
And this, you've talked about the state of journalism. What do you see unfolding?
Well, I mean, it's obviously, it's funny. We were talking before during breakfast about the struggle that churches have had post-COVID. Like a lot of our institutions upon which we have relied and which have helped, I don't know, help us make sense of the universe, have had their struggles. And I think churches have. I go to Idlewild and I think coming back post-COVID has been a struggle for churches all across the land. But journalism has been just a disaster, what has happened in journalism. When I came here, there were 250 journalists at the Commercial Appeal, and 250,000 people got the Commercial Appeal. And whether you liked the Commercial Appeal or had objections to the Commercial Appeal, it felt like everybody read the Commercial Appeal, and everybody started from the same sense of, okay, this is what is happening. And the same thing with Walter Cronkite on TV, like this is what, okay, this is the way it is, and the way it was, or whatever else. And then we could debate if you were, Jimmy Carter, you thought about fixing it one way, and if you were Ronald Reagan, you thought about fixing it another way. But whatever else, you could debate it. Now, the Commercial Appeal that once had 250 journalists has, I don't know, the latest number, 25 journalists. So it's gone from 250 to 25, and 25,000 people roughly get it. So, which is a drop in the ocean compared to our larger community. And then nationally, we pick and choose. Maybe you watch Fox, or maybe you watch, or MSNBC, and I mean, I was astounded. The other day, the Middle East war is happening, and it's a shooting in Maine and whatever, and I turned on Fox, and they were literally talking about Hunter Biden. And I'm like, we live in opposite universes, whatever you think. Like, we live in just... And so now on the national level, I think we see the fact that it's so polarized. But on a local level, the problem is it's just evaporated. There is so many of the important stories of our day. The Flint water crisis, that was discovered by a local newspaper. That was uncovered by a local newspaper. The wrestling coach at Michigan State, that was reported by a local, that was abusing, there was a local newspaper, and on and on and on. And so one of the reasons that I'm happy to have gone to the Daily Memphian, and Dan Conaway is integral in getting that launched and naming us, among other things, is that we just need local news. We need, in the same way that we need a thriving, vibrant Grace St. Luke and other churches, we need a local newspaper. And I'm not saying, I still get the Commercial Appeal. I still get it delivered to my driveway because they give me the employee rate, even though I've been gone for 5 years. But, and I like turning the pages. Like, I still like turning pages. But it is, when we aren't even starting from the same reality, how can you begin to solve the problems that face us? And so, so it's one reason why I really do think, like, the Daily Memphian isn't perfect, but we have double the number of journalists in town because of the Daily Memphian, and I honestly think the Daily Memphian has kept the Commercial Appeal from making bigger cuts than they've made, but just because there are a lot of papers. A quarter of this country's papers between 2005 and now have closed. journalists are down 80% since 2005, and so to have another enterprise doing it, I think, is important.
Okay. So, when you preached at Calvary, something that you talked about was the idea of losing your faith, not just in God, but in where we live in the city of Memphis. And although you spoke earlier about Memphis has helped you, it has been fulfilling in all the ways, and yet it's still complicated. Life here has been unusually hard in recent years. Have you lost faith in this place, or how do you navigate where you are with what you shared some time ago, and here we are today?
I think it's been a very difficult. You all know as well as I do. It's been an incredibly difficult time in Memphis. Obviously, I think what I said in the sermon I gave is that what restores my faith is to look at all the good work that is being done in this city by so many people. Like, life should not be about, this is my great uncle's philosophy, but it seems to me that we all want to live a life of meaning and impact, and the problems of Memphis, to me, are partly when I lived in Washington, D.C., I felt like I was one lawyer among a town of 100,000 lawyers or whatever it was, and I felt like my life was basically meaningless. Whereas here, you look at what Scott Morris did, for example, at Church Health. He came to Memphis because it was one of the poorest cities in America, and he's created that miraculous place that is Church Health. Dr. Justin Baker, when he came to St. Jude, there was no emphasis on how you deal with with death and dying at St. Jude. And he built an entire department based on this, and now Stanford has come and recruited him to do the same thing at Stanford because he did that here. He actually had an his brother came here as a FBI agent because he lived here, and he's now second in charge of the FBI in Memphis because there was opportunity to do good things here. Like, I recently did a column on a guy at the University of Memphis who works on grants, and that wouldn't strike me as something that particularly interesting that you would write about, but he works on raising money and helping people get grants for the University of Memphis. And he had been held up at gunpoint in his driveway as he was working on this incredibly significant grant. And he's like, what is the point of, here I am, I'm working. And then he realized, he said it took him a while, it wasn't cliche and it wasn't easy, but he realized that this is why we do the work. We do the work to solve the problems of the world at the University of Memphis. The University of Memphis isn't just some ivory tower, it's a place where people are working on real problems and all the time. And to me, I don't know, I think the way you have to think about it is it's all that much more important for us to be present and to be here and to be involved and to be optimistic to the extent we can be, and to lift up Memphis because it needs us now. I did Eliza Fletcher's husband reached out to me not long before the 1-year anniversary of her death, and that's a bracing moment. It's one of the wonderful things about being here for 30 years, though, and writing for 30 years, is that he sort of trusted me, and that it really is a privilege to carry people's stories. And so we sat down, and he said there's going to be we had coffee, and he said there's going to be a lot of attention and a lot of this. We're going to do Eliza's run again, but I want you to know that she always had hope. She always had hope. And there feels like there's a lot of hopelessness out there now. And so that was part of the message that he wanted to get across. And so I think that's sort of how I try to make sense of it. If he can make sense of it, I certainly can.
Well, thank you for that. I'm also mindful that the audience give an opportunity to ask some questions because
Oh, yep.
this is such an. If you have a question, if you'll raise your hand, someone has a microphone and they'll come to you. But to take
I'll
some
answer questions about sports too. I do try to stick in touch a little bit with what's happening over there, but so.
So if you'll just throw up your hand and a mic will come your way. Any questions?
Mr. Calkins, this is more a comment than a question.
Yeah.
But I wish your uncle had been able to meet mine in real life. My uncle was the late William A. Jones, former Bishop of Missouri, and I think the two of them would have gotten along together very well.
Well, I'm sure he would have. It's funny, I was reading, I'm blessed with a family of writers, and so they seem to write everything down. And he was minister in Cambridge, Massachusetts during World War I and then heading into World War II. And after World War I, he wrote, he was so discouraged by what happened in the aftermath of World War I that he said, I will never support another war, because it seemed to him that all the things that had been fought for had been squandered. So as they were heading into World War II, this is from a sermon that he wrote then, and it strikes me that it has something to do with how we look at the world, what's happening in the Middle East today. 25 years ago, out of agony, blood, and sacrifice, the way of salvation for nations, as for men, was made clear to us, the way of Jesus Christ, of unselfishness, of brotherliness, of sympathy, and cooperativeness. And once again, we refused to walk therein. National pride, national interests, national ambitions dictated the policy of all nations on earth, and again we have fallen into the pit. All nations have followed the devices and desires of their own hearts. There has been no health in any of us. This world disaster is the work of all of us. America, having helped to win the last war, refused to help make the peace and left those nations infuriated against each other to work out their own damnation. Hitler has made this war, but we, all of us, have helped make Hitler. Not hatred, but humility becomes us all. Shall we never learn that not hatred, but love alone makes for real and lasting peace? Shall we never learn that war destroys more values than it preserves and inevitably degenerates into both ill will and brutality? Has America nothing more to do for the world today than to spend billions in her own defense? It even goes on there. But basically, shall we never learn that not hatred, but love alone makes for real and lasting peace?
Thank you for that. That'll preach.
Right? Oh, I don't know.
Yes. Other questions? Any other questions before we end our time? I want to be mindful.
This may be somewhat repetitive, but I've heard you talk a couple of times before, but I've always wondered about the mental process you went through when you were in the middle of big law, making big bucks in Washington, and made the decision to go to, wasn't it Anniston, Alabama, and for what, $40 a week covering high school football?
$225 a week. Don't cut my pay. The truth is that people, and I think about this with my own kids, because the way people sometimes think about my story, if they happen to think about it at all, is, well, isn't it great? He followed his dream and followed his bliss and eschewed the world of law and became. I think, like so many people, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Like, I muddled into law school, and because I was good at school, and I got good grades, and then you follow a path, right? You just I clerked for James Buckley, William F. Buckley's brother, on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and I mean, it was high octane stuff. I mean, it was. I went one day. I went jogging with Antonin Scalia and because he one of his clerks was a friend of mine. John Roberts recruited me to the law firm, took me to my first lunch at Hogan and Hartson, where I worked, and so it was, and that was all sounds very lofty, except I was miserable. Not just mildly unhappy. I was miserable. I became a profound hypochondriac. I was drinking too much. I just was really intensely unhappy. I don't know what exactly a breakdown looks like, but I was close. And so it wasn't really a choice for me I wasn't told to leave. I could have stayed at the law firm, but in my own mind, I was just intensely unhappy. And I think I look at my own kids who are now 25, 21 and 20, and they're making their way in the world. And I think how hard it is to make their way in the world, that we think so much about where they're going to college as if that's the real choice. And that's not the choice that really matters. What really matters is how you're going to spend your life, and who you're going to have. Are you going to have a partner? Who's your partner? Like, those are the things that really will shape your life, it seems to me. And and so I just really struggled. And when I went into journalism, I loved, from the first day in Anniston, I loved it. Because it's the opposite. When I was a lawyer at a huge law firm, I spent my day in the library reviewing documents or whatever else. I wasn't in court at a 500 lawyer law firm. And here I was out and meeting with people and telling their stories. But $225 a week wasn't sustainable. And so I always knew I could go back and be a lawyer if I wanted to, I thought. But it worked out perfectly. The problem is when we tell these stories, people will ask me, how do I do what you do? We tell them in reverse. We tell them, we know that it ended reasonably happily for me. Like, I'm thrilled with how my life has gone. It's harder for me to talk to the 20-year-olds or the 18-year-olds or the whatever, and particularly if they want to go into journalism now, because it's so difficult. So I don't know, but it wasn't. I like a lot of people, I think I muddled through. It wasn't some great clean, thought that I had and had it off happily. It was a process of figuring it out.
So we have
Thanks for asking.
one last question
Okay.
from Bob King. One and then last. Oliver.
Okay, sports question. The Daily Memphian reports that the local college sports teams sometimes have their struggles. But down at the high school level, across all sports, all the boys and girls, is thriving, energetic, and joyful. Is that the way you see it, and can we hope that continues?
Oh, I don't know that split is. I mean, there are certainly joyful things about college sports and pro sports, and so. But it's funny. High school sports is John Varlas covers high school sports for us and does a really good job of covering high school sports for us. That's a thankless job, though, because there's dozens and dozens of high schools, and there's dozens and dozens of athletes, and so. But he will tell you that there's the same kind of recruiting that goes on in college, goes at the highest level, goes on in high school, and there's all kinds of misbehavior in high school sports and lack of priorities and all of that same thing. I think that's endemic to us. It's funny though, as my kids weren't great athletes, there is nothing quite like watching your kids compete. It's really fun. Like my son Peter decided one day that he'd run cross country, and I'm like, "What are you talking about? Why would you do that? You've got to get up at 6 a.m. and run for 12 miles a day. Are you nuts?" I just became the biggest cross country fan, But it's the straight. You would see him at the beginning of the race, and then off they'd go. And you may catch him somewhere in the middle of the race if you were lucky. It's the worst spectator sport ever, but I was never happier than watching Peter run cross country. And so I like to think that there is at least at the rank and file of high school sports, just like, for example, honestly, women's soccer at the University of Memphis, if you just take money out of it, if it's not then I think sports actually do tend to be healthy. The place where they become unhealthy is when people think, I can use this ability to put a ball in a hoop to make $20 million, and or my kid can use his ability to put this ball in a hoop. Beyond that, I think sports is still pretty healthy at the grassroots level.
A couple of years ago, I know at least Ollie and I were in this room with probably many of you when Micah Greenstein was leading a discussion, and the topic at that moment was about the power of group prayer, and it originated from somebody asking asking Micah, do you think that getting your fellow Christians to pray for somebody who was sick or something like that, does that really work or not? And his answer really struck me and struck a chord with me, and I know it did with Ollie because we talked about it afterwards. His answer was, pray as if God can do it all, but act as if you must do it all. How do you react to that?
That's beautiful. I wish I'd written it myself. No, that's spectacular. I mean, in the wake of the latest mass shooting in Maine, what you heard from some was, this is a time for prayer, and I'm not saying it wasn't a time for prayer, but I think pray as if prayer can, exactly as you said it, pray as if prayer will do it all, and act as if it won't. You must do it all. So I love that. I'll steal it. It'll be in a column soon.
Well, thank you all for being here, and Geoff, thank you for being just so open with us here at Grace St. Luke's, and for your contributions. It's the truest sense of a ministry. You're using your gifts and talents in a variety of ways, and you're grounded in your faith, and that has informed so much of what you do, and I know to me that's inspiring and encouraging to be reminded of the faith that lives in us to navigate this life that we have. So let us give thanks for Geoff.
Thanks. Appreciate it.